Hey guys, tonight we're marching very slowly into the world of ancient Rome with why you wouldn't last a day in the Roman legion, and more. Don't worry, no shouting generals or clashing swords here. Just a calm, detailed look at the exhausting routines, heavy armour, strict rules and rough conditions that legionaries faced every single day. It wasn't glorious, it was mostly tiring. So get comfy, relax, and let the quiet struggles of a Roman soldiers lull you gently to sleep. Why you wouldn't last a day in the Roman legion. You think you're tough. Maybe you've done a workout or two, hiked a steep hill, or even tried fasting for a day. But imagine standing in a stone courtyard in the searing Mediterranean sun, your feet blistered from days of marching, and a grizzled centurion shouting orders in Latin you barely understand. That's just the welcome mat. Welcome to the Roman legion. Joining the Roman army wasn't like signing up for a job. It was closer to signing your life away. Recruits, often poor peasants or rural youths, were expected to dedicate 25 years to the service of the empire. You couldn't quit, you couldn't complain, and most of the time you couldn't even write your own name on the enlistment scroll. The pay was modest, the work backbreaking, and the punishment for failure, sometimes death. Your training began before you were handed a sword. First, you marched. Then you marched some more. You were expected to cover 20 Roman miles per day, roughly 30 kilometres, in full armour. That armour? It weighed up to 45 pounds, not counting weapons, rations and your construction tools. Every legionary was also a builder carrying a shovel and a pickaxe to construct camps at the end of each long sweaty march. Now picture this. You've just finished marching across uneven terrain for 6 hours. Your calves ache. Your sandals have rubbed your feet raw. You finally stop and you think, maybe there's food, rest, number. You're ordered to dig a trench around your camp. Every night the legion built a fortified encampment from scratch, ditches, ramparts and wooden palisades. This wasn't just discipline, it was survival. Surprise attacks were a constant threat. Legionaries ate together, slept together and suffered together. The daily diet was simple and repetitive. Grain porridge, pulse, dry bread, cheese, sometimes vinegar mixed with water. Meat was rare unless you were on a lucky campaign or hunting wild animals was allowed. Sanitation was minimal and lice were as common as pebbles. Illness spread quickly in the tightly packed tents. And hygiene? Well, you had the sponge on a stick. That was the Roman toilet paper, dipped in vinegar and shared communally in public latrines. You had to be efficient in everything, eating, defecating, cleaning your armour. Idleness was punished, and if you broke formation in battle or fell asleep on watch, the punishment could be as brutal as decimation, where 1 in every 10 men was executed by their own comrades. Then there were the punishments for cowardice or disobedience. The Roman military code was strict. If a unit failed in battle, the blame often landed on everyone. Soldiers might be beaten with vitis rods by their superiors, or even stoned to death in front of the entire legion. Pain and fear were part of the discipline. Despite the cruelty, the Roman legion was highly organised and surprisingly forward-thinking. Recruits were trained in engineering, road building, medical treatment and battlefield logistics. There were dedicated medici, field doctors with tools not so different from modern scalpels. But without anaesthesia or antibiotics, even a small wound could turn deadly. If you got an infection, there wasn't much a Roman medic could do besides apply honey, herbs or cauterization. Survival wasn't guaranteed, even off the battlefield. And speaking of battle, forget what you've seen in the movies. Roman warfare was less about heroic duels and more about relentless formations, coordination and attrition. You didn't charge recklessly. You held your line, shield to shield, trusting the man next to you. Your job wasn't to fight like a gladiator. It was to stab and advance. Stab and advance. Over and over. The famous Roman testudo formation, where shields formed a tortoise-like shell, was both protection and prison. You couldn't see much. You couldn't hear clearly. If you were injured in formation, the legion might march right over you. Emotion was a liability. Noise, fear and screaming filled the air during combat, but you had to stay quiet, focused and in sync with dozens of other men. You were also expected to keep your gear immaculate. Every morning your centurion inspected your weapons and armour. A dull sword, a rusty helmet or unpolished sandals could lead to punishment. Discipline wasn't just about battle readiness. It was a psychological weapon. If the legion functioned like a machine, the enemy couldn't find its weak link. And what about your free time? Well, you didn't really have much. Maybe once a week, if you were lucky, you'd get a moment to relax, play dice with your tent mates, or write a crude message on a wax tablet home. But most letters were censored, and literacy wasn't widespread. You missed home, but going home, that was decades away, if you survived. Still, not all was pain and misery. If you made it to retirement, you were granted land or money, and sometimes Roman citizenship, a rare and valuable gift if you weren't born with it. But many never made it that far. Disease, ambushes, mutiny, and brutal campaigns in far-flung provinces took countless lives. Even if you were lucky enough to dodge swords and arrows, you might still fall to pneumonia in a cold Germanic forest. So why did men sign up? Sometimes for survival, sometimes for glory, and sometimes because they simply had no choice. The Roman war machine needed flesh to function, and once you were in, it ground you down until you either broke or became one with it. But here's a question you might ask yourself as you picture standing on that sun-beaten training field, sweating through your leather tunic, shivering in your tent at night, your stomach growling with hunger. Was the promise of land and legacy really worth trading away your youth, and possibly your life, for 25 years of marching, digging and bleeding? You've survived training. Your feet are calloused, your back aches, and you've learned to swing your gladius in perfect rhythm just as the centurion barked. Now comes the real test. Not practice, not marching, not digging, but war. The order comes with no ceremony. You're being deployed. Maybe it's Germania, where freezing forests swallow men whole. Maybe it's Britannia, all fog and rebellion. Or maybe it's Parthia, where the dry winds sting your skin and the arrows fall like rain. Wherever Rome decides to send you, it doesn't ask for your opinion. You march. A Roman legion on the move was a logistical miracle and a sensory ordeal. You weren't just carrying your shield and sword, you hauled cooking pots, tent stakes, rations and your personal effects if you had any. The joke among soldiers was that mules had it easier. On a campaign you might walk for weeks before ever seeing an enemy, and if you were unlucky you wouldn't see them at all until they were already on top of you. The roads, where they existed, were impressive. Built to last, wide enough for legions to pass through in formation, they cut through forests and across mountains like veins of stone. But not every land was blessed with Roman roads. Often you slogged through muddy valleys, slippery hillsides or snow-drifted paths, and when the mud dried on your sandals and cloaks, you still had to look like a soldier. Clean armour, sharp blade, clean-shaven face. At night, after the usual construction of fortified camps, the guards were assigned their 4-night watches. You might draw the second or third, which meant you'd have to wake in the dark, teeth chattering, listening for enemy movement. One mistake, one yawn too loud, and you might face collective punishment. No one wanted to die because you drifted off to sleep. Finally, you arrive near the enemy. You set up camp again, but this time, there's tension in the air. You hear rumours, maybe the Gauls are nearby, maybe the local tribes have spies. The centurions walk faster, the tribunes read orders more sternly. You're told to prepare. Before battle, the legion didn't just charge in. Everything was measured, shields were inspected, formations drilled. Even the caligae, your military sandals, were checked for wear. You were fed a light meal and expected to maintain discipline. No panic, no unnecessary talk. Then came the signal, maybe a trumpet blast, maybe a banner wave, and suddenly you're moving. Shield in front, sword in hand, eyes forward, you're not thinking about glory. You're thinking about not tripping, not being the first to die, and not breaking the line. In formation you felt safe, but also helpless. You could barely see past your comrades. When contact came, it came fast and without warning. One moment you're marching, the next, you're pushing your shield against another man, hearing metal grind, smelling sweat and blood. You don't swing wildly, you stab forward, aim low, and keep your shield up. Over and over. The gladius was short for a reason. Battles were up close, suffocating. You didn't duel, you stabbed into the gaps between shields. The man to your left had your life in his hands, and you had his in yours. If he faltered, your flank was exposed. You didn't get a heroic speech from the general. If you were lucky, you got eye contact from your centurion. If you were unlucky, he'd shout in your face until your ears rang. But during battle, there were no words, just grunts, screams, the crack of shields hitting bone, and the constant rhythmic drumming of death. And then came the archers. If they were yours, you prayed they didn't hit you by mistake. If they were the enemy's, you prayed they missed altogether. Roman soldiers carried scutum shields large enough to protect much of the body, but arrows always found the gaps, and once the cavalry came, chaos reigned. Horses and infantry rarely mixed well. One horse running through a line could break it. That meant disaster. If you were wounded, things got worse. Maybe you made it back behind the lines. Maybe a medicus stitched you up with gut thread, packed your wound with vinegar-soaked cloth and said a prayer. But if the wound festered, amputation maybe, or just waiting to die slowly. There were no hospitals, no therapy, no real recovery time. If you could stand, you were expected to return to duty. Limping? That's fine. Coughing blood? Just don't collapse in formation. You saw friends die, sometimes instantly, sometimes slowly. You couldn't mourn, not openly, not in front of the officers. You buried them in shallow pits behind the camp if there was time. If not, the dead were left behind. War was constant, and Rome had no time for grief. And yet, in the silence after battle, there was a strange rhythm to it all. Soldiers cleaned their weapons. They repaired their armour. They whispered jokes under their breath, trying to laugh away the horror. Some carved markings into their shields, names, symbols, prayers. Others sang old songs to keep their minds off the nightmares. Loot was sometimes allowed. After a successful campaign, Roman soldiers might be permitted to take valuables, coins, rings, even clothes, from the enemy dead. This was less about greed and more about compensation. Rome's pay wasn't generous, and a lucky soldier might collect enough spoils to one day buy land. But many didn't live that long. Campaigns could last months, sometimes years. You didn't get to go home for a while. Your letters, if you wrote them, took weeks to reach anyone, and you couldn't even be sure your family still lived. Bandits, famine, and disease claimed as many lives as any war. Still, you kept marching, kept fighting, because that's what you were now. A cog in the Empire's machine, a human wall that stretched from the deserts of Syria to the rivers of Gaul, and if you broke, the whole line might fall. Yet here's a haunting thought to end the day. Even if you survived all of it, training, marching, hunger, injury, war, when your 25 years were up and your body was bent and scarred, would Rome keep its promise? Would you get your land, your pension? Or would some bureaucrat in a toga claim your records were misplaced? 25 years! That's how long you've given the Empire. 25 years of sweat, blood, hunger, and obedience. If you've made it this far, you've outlived disease, mutiny, ambushes, bad commanders, worse weather, and maybe even a few emperors. The average man never had this kind of longevity. Not in peacetime, and certainly not in the army. But now you stand at the edge of something unfamiliar. Freedom. You're no longer property of the state, no longer bound by orders or the hissed threats of a centurion. At least that's the theory. In practice, it's complicated. Retirement from the Roman legion wasn't a single moment. It was a process. You weren't just told thank you and handed a gold coin. First came paperwork. You were issued a diploma militaris, a bronze document confirming your honourable discharge, and, more importantly, your citizenship, if you didn't already have it. That alone changed your status in the eyes of Rome. You could now vote, own land, and legally marry. Things you may have assumed were yours long ago. Next came the pension, a lump sum or a parcel of land, often in the provinces where you served. Sometimes this land was fertile, sometimes it was a rocky hillside no one wanted, and sometimes it was already claimed by hostile locals. Veterans were used as seeds, planted across the empire to Romanize newly conquered lands. But land wasn't guaranteed. If Rome was short on cash, and it often was, your promised pension might be delayed, or forgotten, or contested by a local governor too lazy or too corrupt to care. Some veterans received nothing but a dismissive nod and a patch of swamp to settle. So now what? You're older, your joints ache, your hands have long since grown calloused and stiff. You're not suited to manual labour anymore, but you don't know much else. Farming might be possible if you're given land worth tilling, but after 25 years of fighting, ploughing soil might feel just as brutal as any campaign. And what of your family? If you had one before you joined, they may be gone now. If you started one during your service, unofficially of course, since soldiers weren't always allowed to marry, You may find them waiting in the shadows of a border, town, living on scraps. Citizenship now legalizes your union, but it doesn't put food on the table. The Roman Empire liked to portray its veterans as heroes, pillars of the state. But in truth, once your usefulness was gone, you became a political inconvenience. Too many veterans in one area could lead to unrest. Some emperors, like Augustus, tried to settle soldiers in distant provinces to keep them productive and far from trouble. Others simply let them fade into the population. Some veterans were lucky. They were granted veteran colonies, planned settlements with homes, farmland, and fellow ex-legionaries. In these places, discipline lingered. Morning routines still echoed army habits. Former soldiers shared war stories, swapped coin, and watched the horizon with suspicious eyes, half expecting a barbarian charge that would never come. Others found work as bodyguards, mercenaries, or tavern keepers. The military experience, though brutal, gave some an edge in civilian life, but not everyone could make the transition. The trauma, though unspoken, ran deep. Rome didn't have a name for what we'd now call post-traumatic stress. There were no therapists, no veteran support clinics. If you had nightmares, if you flinched at loud noises, or drank too much wine to sleep through the night, no one cared. And not all veterans stayed loyal. A few, especially those who felt cheated, joined rebel causes, sold their skills to local warlords, or even fought against Rome later in life. It was a bitter irony. The same soldiers once used to expand the empire were sometimes the ones who helped tear at its edges in its decline. Perhaps worst of all, you weren't remembered. The average legionary wasn't etched into marble or immortalized in poems. Your name didn't appear in history books. You were just one of thousands, buried in a simple grave with maybe a small inscription. Here lies Marcus, soldier of the 10th Legion, served well, died free. Even your weapons, your armour, objects you carried every day for decades, were often sold or melted down. The past wasn't preserved, it was recycled. Rome valued what you could give, not who you were, and yet there was a quiet dignity in it. You were part of something vast. You helped shape the roads, towns and borders of a civilization that would echo through centuries. You fought in battles that would one day become legends. You endured cold nights on foreign soil and blistering days beneath foreign suns. You didn't last a day in the Roman legion. You lasted 25 years. But now that it's over, now that your boots are off, your sword is hung on the wall, and your campfires are only memories, what do you do with yourself? What do you do when no one is shouting orders anymore and no one is watching your back? Do you find peace in the silence, or does it feel too quiet? The real nightmares of medieval dentistry. You're lying on a wooden board in a dim stone room. There's no pillow. There's no anesthesia. There's just the smell of sweat, old blood, damp linen, and a faint tang of something burning. Maybe herbs, maybe hair. A man looms over you with iron tongs. His sleeves are rolled up. His hands are dirty. He's not a doctor. He might not even be sober. But you need him, because your tooth is killing you. Medieval life was tough, and if you were unlucky enough to get a toothache in the year 1274, there were few options, none of them good. Dentistry as we know it today did not exist. There were no toothbrushes, no floss, no numbing gels, and certainly no smiling assistants in clean white coats. Oral hygiene wasn't even a serious topic. Most people didn't know why their teeth rotted. They just knew that they did, and that it hurt like nothing else when it happened. The pain could begin as a dull throb, the kind that pulses behind the eye and radiates into the skull. Over days or weeks it would grow worse. Chewing hurt, speaking hurt, breathing cold air across the tooth hurt. There were no painkillers beyond ale, wine, and, if you were lucky, poppy-based tinctures, which only worked if you could afford them and knew someone who brewed them. Most of the time people just endured. Many didn't have all their teeth by age 30. In fact, for peasants, losing a few teeth early was almost expected. Hard bread, grains ground with bits of stone from rough millstones, and no dental tools meant that every bite slowly wore your teeth down. You could be in your 20s and already have exposed nerves. In towns and villages, the local tooth puller might be the same person who cut hair, bled people with leeches, and occasionally pulled splinters from horse hooves. If you lived in a city, you had more options, but not necessarily better ones. Surgeons existed, but most had little formal training. They learned from apprenticeships and saw teeth as just another part of the body to be yanked, burned, or lanced. Some believed toothaches were caused by tooth worms. Yes, literal worms. The idea was that small parasites burrowed into the tooth and caused pain by wriggling around. This belief was surprisingly widespread, and some treatments involved smoking herbs into the mouth in the hope of driving the worms out. Others swore by heating metal rods and placing them near the gums to smoke the demons or worms out of their hiding spots. If none of that worked, and it rarely did, there was only one option left: extraction. You were told to sit still. You weren't given anything to bite down on unless the practitioner was thoughtful or had lost too many clients to shock. The extraction tool might be a dental pelican, named for its beak-shaped end, or just a large pair of pliers. No sterilisation, no guarantees. The process was brutal. The tool was clamped around the infected tooth, and pressure was applied. Quick, forceful, and unsparing. The tooth rarely came out cleanly. Sometimes it shattered, sending tiny shards into your tongue or throat. Sometimes the jaw fractured. The bleeding could be significant, especially if the gum tore, and if infection followed, which it often did, death was not out of the question. There are records of people dying not from the toothache itself, but from the attempt to remove it. Sepsis or blood poisoning was poorly understood. Wounds were packed with dirty rags, rinsed with river water or wine, and left open to the elements. A cut in the mouth could become a festering sore in days. Yet even knowing the risks, people begged for it, because the pain of a decaying molar pressing into a nerve, untreated for weeks, could drive even the strongest person to madness. We imagine medieval people being tough, and they were, but they were also desperate. A knight who could hold a sword for hours in battle might break into sobs under the torture of a single rotting tooth. Mothers who'd birthed children in freezing huts might beg for someone, anyone, to take the damn thing out. And superstition didn't help. Some thought bad teeth were punishment for sin. Others thought they were signs of demonic possession or bad humours. A few carried amulets with ground wolf teeth or pressed copper plates against their cheekbones to draw out the evil. If you were lucky enough to keep your teeth through your teens and 20s, the battle still wasn't over. Aging meant more decay. Gums receded, teeth darkened, enamel cracked. There was no solution. Dentures made from bone, ivory, or even wood existed, but they were rare and uncomfortable. Often, they were more decorative than functional. And let's not forget the breath. Halitosis was common, overpowering even. People covered their mouths with scarves in winter, not just for warmth, but to hide odours. Lovers might avoid kissing altogether. Clergy sometimes anointed gums with vinegar or honey not to heal them, but just to make them smell more bearable during confession. Even royalty suffered. In fact, some of the worst cases of dental rot in medieval Europe were found in royal remains. Sugary diets, access to rich food, and poor hygiene meant that monarchs often had worse teeth than the peasants they ruled. So you see, in the medieval world, a toothache wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a ticking clock. Each day of pain might be followed by infection, swelling, a cracked jawbone, or even death. And if you did manage to survive a brutal extraction, you still had to chew, and food wasn't soft, so your tooth has been yanked out, or perhaps shattered in place. Your jaw's swollen, your tongue is thick with the taste of blood and old metal, and every breath feels like it brushes against a glowing coal inside your mouth. You've survived the first ordeal, but the suffering isn't over. In medieval Europe there was no aftercare as we know it. No antibiotics, no antiseptic mouthwash. Once the tooth was removed, if it came out at all, you were often handed a cloth, told to press it against your face and then sent home. Maybe someone muttered a prayer over you. Maybe you staggered home through muddy lanes, bent over with pain, praying your jaw wouldn't turn black. Infection was not just common, it was expected. The mouth is full of bacteria, and medieval tools weren't cleaned between patients. A tooth puller might go from one peasant to the next with the same iron tongs, wiping them on his apron in between. If someone ahead of you had a rotting abscess or disease, it was now in your bloodstream too. Sometimes salt was packed into the socket, other times dried herbs, moss, or even chewed bread. If the pain persisted, they might apply a hot poker to the wound to cauterize the evil. Imagine that, your mouth pried open, and a heated metal rod pressed against exposed gum and bone. Some patients passed out, others bit their own tongues in shock, but the burning, oddly enough, sometimes helped. It sealed the wound and prevented more bacteria from getting in, if it didn't kill you from the trauma first. Now, let's talk tools. The dental pelican, one of the most feared implements, looked like a bent beak. It was used to grip the tooth and twist it free with a rocking motion. Another was the tooth key, shaped like a key but ending in a cruel curved claw. The practitioner would insert the claw, anchor it against the tooth, and then turn the device like a corkscrew. This often crushed surrounding bone in the process. Even worse were improvised tools, pliers, knives, chisels, fish hooks. A blacksmith might use the same tongs to remove a tooth and then bend horseshoes. The line between dentistry and torture was thin, and many operations looked more like interrogations. And who were these so-called dentists? Very few people specialised in dentistry alone. The profession didn't exist in any organised form until the 18th century. In medieval times, the task often fell to barber surgeons, recognisable by the red and white pole that symbolised blood and bandages. These men shaved beards in the morning, pulled teeth in the afternoon, and amputated limbs by nightfall. They were skilled in a sense, practised at speed and blood control, but their knowledge was patchy at best. In rural villages, you didn't even get a barber surgeon. You got the local wise woman, the village bone setter, or whoever owned a pair of forceps. People with no formal training, no education, and often no understanding of anatomy. The only thing they knew was that the pain had to stop, one way or another. But even in the highest echelons of society, dental agony reigned. Take Queen Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen of England. By the time she reached middle age, her teeth were blackened and mostly gone, a result of sugar-heavy diets and little to no cleaning. Foreign ambassadors described her as charming, but lacking in oral beauty, which was a polite way of saying her breath could kill a dove. Some believe she had teeth extracted, perhaps even with force, despite being queen. But no records confirm what sort of pain she endured behind closed palace doors. Or consider King Louis XIV of France. The Sun King suffered from recurring dental infections and abscesses. At one point, his doctors performed a procedure that removed several teeth, parts of his jawbone, and a large portion of the roof of his mouth. Afterward, he reportedly had trouble speaking and eating, and food would leak from his nose when he tried to swallow. Royalty might have had access to the best surgeons, but even the best were still working blind. There were no x-rays, no understanding of bacteria, and no sedation. What set monarchs apart wasn't the quality of the procedure. It was the privacy in which they could scream. Even more horrifying were the primitive dentures of the time. Some were carved from wood, though these were rare. Others were made from animal teeth, or dead human teeth, often looted from battlefields, or taken from executed criminals. These were then tied onto existing teeth with bits of wire or string. They were uncomfortable, unsanitary, and prone to slipping mid-sentence, but they filled the gaps. Imagine smiling at court, only for a tooth to fall into your goblet. There were even attempts at early fillings, though they were dangerous. Some used lead, mercury, or molten metal to fill cavities, substances that were later found to be highly toxic. But at the time, pain relief was more important than long-term health. People were willing to trade years off their life if it meant sleeping through a single night without jaw pain. Religion and superstition continued to colour every aspect of treatment. Some monks believed certain saints could cure toothache if prayed to properly. Pilgrims travelled to shrines to ask for divine healing, leaving behind their extracted teeth as offerings. Others believed in charms, astrology, or the alignment of stars. A popular belief in parts of Germany held that burying a pulled tooth beneath the threshold of your house would protect you from pain in the future. But no prayer, no charm, no position of the stars could stop the slow decay of bone and nerve once it began. If you were lucky, you'd lose the tooth and live. If you weren't, if the infection reached your bloodstream or brain, you'd die in agony, quietly, without a name, perhaps without anyone realizing your death was caused by a molar. And the truly tragic thing, you wouldn't be remembered for the pain you endured. No chronicler would write about the tooth that ended your life. You'd be just another corpse in the graveyard, mouth open in a grim parody of a smile, jaw still swollen from a battle no one saw. You survived the pain, the tools, the burnings, and the blood, or maybe you didn't. Either way, time passed, and your body, like so many others in the Middle Ages, was eventually returned to the earth. And that's where the story of medieval dentistry has continued to whisper, not through scrolls or illuminated texts, but through bones. Archaeologists today unearth thousands of skeletons across Europe every year, from forgotten village cemeteries to churchyards buried beneath modern cities. And when they look closely, especially at the skulls, they find a history more revealing than any manuscript. Teeth remain long after skin and sinew are gone. They're often the best preserved part of the human body. And in these remains, researchers have found evidence of lives lived in chronic dental pain, cavities, rot, shattered enamel, severely worn molars, infections that bored deep holes into the jawbone itself. In some skulls, the abscess cavities are so large they could have caused permanent facial swelling and grotesque disfigurement in life. In others, a single blackened tooth sits alone in a row of gaps, likely the last one that held out before infection set in. The jawbone around it shows signs of swelling and healing, meaning the person lived with that pain for months, possibly years, before death. In one particularly chilling discovery from a 14th century London cemetery, researchers found a young woman with her jawbone nearly split in two by an untreated dental abscess. The swelling had hollowed out part of her lower face, but she lived long enough for some bone regrowth to begin. She must have endured incredible pain just to eat, just to speak. And she was barely in her 20s. These skeletal remains speak to the ordinariness of suffering. Pain was a daily companion, not an emergency. Most medieval people didn't visit a healer until things were unbearable. By then, it was usually too late. And it wasn't just tooth decay that left its mark. Diet played a brutal role. The coarse grind of medieval flour, full of tiny stones from primitive millstones, acted like sandpaper. Over time, these particles wore down enamel like beach glass, dull, flat, and brittle. Even bread could be dangerous. And yet, through all this misery, there were glimmers, tiny flickers of progress. In the late medieval period, particularly in Italy and parts of France, texts began to emerge that hinted at a deeper interest in the human body. One such text was The Little Book of the Teeth, 1488, a strange hybrid of superstition and science, which suggested boiling tools before use, an accidental nod toward sterilization. Another treatise written in 1492 advised practitioners to examine the gums carefully before pulling a tooth, revolutionary for its time. And by the early 1500s, some barber surgeons began to distinguish themselves as dental men, specializing in oral procedures. It would take centuries, of course, for modern dentistry to be born, but the seeds were there. Oddly, one of the unexpected steps forward came not from medicine, but from the church. Monks in monastic communities often recorded the illnesses they encountered, and some began to notice patterns, that dental problems worsened with diet, with age, and with neglect. A few monasteries began experimenting with basic oral hygiene, rinsing with wine or salt water after meals, for instance. It wasn't effective in the modern sense, but it showed an emerging curiosity. Could pain be prevented, not just endured? Outside of religion, folk traditions slowly began to evolve too. In some households, a softened twig, called a chew stick, was used to rub the teeth and gums. These weren't very effective, but they signalled a shift in mindset. Your mouth wasn't just a source of suffering. It could be maintained, even preserved. And as trade expanded and books became more widely available in the 16th century, ideas spread faster. A merchant in Venice might hear of a special paste being used in Cairo, a blend of mint and salt, and bring it home. A university student in Paris might read about Islamic physicians in Cordoba who use silver tools to probe infected teeth. A noblewoman in Vienna might pay a travelling surgeon double to perform a procedure learned in Baghdad. Pain still reigned, of course, but slowly the idea of dental care began to matter. Still, for most medieval people, those changes came far too late. By the time you were 40, if you lived that long, your smile was likely a grim patchwork of loose molars, jagged gaps, and exposed nerves. Your breath reeked of infection. Your jaw clicked when you chewed. And if a tooth ached too long, there was only one path forward: the chair, the tool, the wrenching twist, and silence. No one wrote epic poems about this pain. Bards didn't sing about molars, but that doesn't mean it didn't shape lives. A toothache could change your diet, your speech, your sleep. It could turn a lively person quiet. It could end a marriage. It could ruin a sermon. It could quite literally drive someone mad. And yet, here's the most sobering thought of all. Most people didn't complain. Not because they were stoic heroes, but because pain was normal. It was simply part of being alive. In the end, medieval dentistry wasn't just about missing teeth and bad breath. It was a slow, silent war. A war against pain, waged without knowledge, without tools, and without hope. One mouth at a time, and we remember none of their names. Why you'd regret taking a bath in the Middle Ages. You probably imagine a medieval peasant as filthy, mud-caked, lice-ridden and brown with layers of sweat. And to be fair, that image isn't entirely wrong, but it isn't exactly right either. In fact, the truth is far more unpleasant. Everyone, from kings to cowherds, smelled bad. But it wasn't always because they didn't want to be clean. Often it was because being clean was confusing, dangerous, and in some cases, even sinful. Let's begin with the most basic question. How often did people bathe? In early medieval times, say the 9th or 10th centuries, bathing was more common than you might think. Communal bathhouses were widespread in many parts of Europe, especially in cities with Roman influence. In places like Paris, Cologne and London, bathhouses were used by men and women, sometimes even together, and they were heated with wood fires beneath great wooden tubs. But here's the first twist. These bathhouses weren't just for cleaning, they were places to relax, socialise and often have sex. Many public baths doubled as brothels, or at the very least places of temptation. Over time, that reputation led to moral suspicion. By the 13th and 14th centuries, the church began to frown on public bathing, not because it was unclean, but because it was too clean, too sensual, too suspicious. By the 15th century, especially after outbreaks of plague, public bathhouses across much of Europe were shuttered. The logic was that heat opened the pores, allowing sickness to enter the body. The very act of bathing was reimagined as a health risk, and so, slowly, washing fell out of fashion. Now, if you lived in a rural village, you didn't even have access to a public bath. A bath meant a wooden tub filled with water from the well, heated if you were lucky, but water was heavy, firewood was expensive, and soap, which was made from lye and animal fat, was harsh and hard to come by. So people didn't bathe daily, or weekly, or even monthly. Instead, most peasants practiced what historians call dry washing. They wiped their faces with rough linen, scraped off visible dirt with knives or pumice stones, and rubbed herbs like rosemary or mint under their arms. They changed their clothes more often than they washed their bodies, and even that depended on how many clothes they owned. And what about the rich? Surely lords and ladies fared better? Not really. Wealthy people might have access to scented oils or perfumes, but their actual bathing practices were limited. A noble woman might bathe once a month, perhaps more if she were young and unmarried. Her clothes would be washed by servants, and her body might be wiped down with rosewater or vinegar. But full immersion in water was rare. One nobleman, Jean de Joinville, wrote in the 13th century that he had only bathed twice in his life, once at birth and once when recovering from an illness. And this was considered pious. The belief at the time was that water weakened the body, loosened the flesh, and made you more susceptible to disease. Better to layer on scented garments and remain dry than risk death for the sake of vanity. Hair was another battlefield. Peasant women often covered their hair entirely in kerchiefs or wimples, not for modesty, but to hide lice and filth. Combs were used to dislodge insects, but regular washing of the scalp was rare. Many rubbed ash or sand into the scalp to absorb oil. Men, especially knights or clergy, would simply shave their heads and call it holy. Even among the elite, lice were so common that many people owned personal lice combs made from ivory or bone. These were prized possessions, carried in small cases like jewellery. The presence of lice didn't indicate poverty. It was just a fact of medieval life. But perhaps the most shocking detail of all was the smell. No amount of perfumes or dried herbs could hide the overwhelming stench of medieval Europe. Streets were filled with the stink of manure, rotting food, human waste and stagnant water. Inside homes, chamber pots were emptied out of windows, meaning the sides of houses often reeked of urine. Soap was used for clothing more than for skin, and when people got wet, say, in the rain, the odour intensified. Historical records often mention this, but not always in disgust. People didn't notice the smell the way we do. A chronicler might describe a queen's gown as fragrant with lavender, even though her hair hadn't been washed in months. A knight returning from battle might be praised for his earthy scent, which meant he smelled like sweat and leather, not soap. To be clean, in medieval terms, didn't mean being odour-free. It meant not being covered in visible muck. The irony, of course, is that the more you tried to be clean by avoiding water, the dirtier you became. But people believed they were doing the right thing, avoiding illness, avoiding temptation, avoiding sin. And those who bathed too often, they were mocked. One French proverb from the 14th century went, "He who washes too often is not to be trusted." Another warned that frequent bathing would loosen a woman's virtue. Even royal physicians sometimes advised against bathing more than once or twice a year, unless you were trying to purge excess bile. So while we often laugh at the idea of a dirty peasant, the truth is cleanliness was confusing, risky, and deeply tied to morality and class. In a world without germ theory, without plumbing, and without soap factories, staying clean required money, energy, and, worst of all, courage. And here's the question that lingers. If you were suddenly transported back to the Middle Ages, would you risk a bath, or play it safe and stay dirty? Let's say you wake up one chilly morning in a typical medieval village. The sun has barely crested the thatched rooftops, and already the stink of life is in the air. Dung, cooking fires, stale straw. But you've got work to do, and no one is waiting for you to take a bath. Because of course there is no bath. Instead, like most villagers, your morning cleaning is a short affair. You might splash a little cold water from the communal barrel onto your face, if you're lucky enough to get there before the livestock do. You wipe your eyes and nose with a bit of coarse wool or a corner of your tunic. That's it. You're ready. No toothbrush, no soap, no mirror. You might chew on a sprig of sage or parsley if it's in season to freshen your breath. But that's about all. Your teeth are yellow, worn, maybe loose. Your gums ache sometimes. But so do everyone else's, and now it's time for breakfast, which you prepare with the same hands you used to clean the chicken coop yesterday. No one washes their hands before eating. In fact, you probably don't even realise it's an option. Your hands are always dirty, because clean doesn't mean germ-free. Germs aren't known to exist. Clean means free of visible mud and grease, and even that is optional. In wealthier homes, like the manor hall of a local noble, things aren't much better. Yes, a servant may bring in warm water and a bowl in the morning, along with a linen cloth for the lord and lady to wash up. But this is more ceremonial than hygienic. It involves dabbing the hands and face with scented water, rose, lavender or vinegar, but not scrubbing, not soaking. Just enough to give the appearance of civility. Baths, if taken, are rare and planned. They're an event, not a routine. If a bath is on the schedule, say, once a month, or on a holy day, it begins with fetching water from the well or river. That means multiple heavy buckets, carried over long distances. Then the water must be boiled, poured into a wooden tub, and cooled slightly so as not to burn the skin. All this for a bath that multiple people will share. The father might go first, followed by the mother, then the children in descending order. By the time the youngest climbs in, the water is dark and lukewarm. It's no wonder people avoided it. So instead of bathing, medieval folks relied on clothing as their first line of defence. Layers were everything. A linen shift or chemise was worn next to the skin to soak up sweat and oil. Over it, woolen tunics, aprons and cloaks. The outer garments were rarely washed, but the linen could be rinsed, maybe once a week, maybe less. And even then, only in summer when the weather allowed for drying. The result? People didn't try to clean themselves. They just kept the filth off their nice clothes. Now let's talk about the bathroom. There isn't one. In the countryside, villagers use a latrine, essentially a trench, shared by the community and dug into the ground. Sometimes it's behind a hedge. Sometimes it's just a spot you hope isn't too soggy. In cities, things are worse. Chamber pots are used indoors and dumped out of upper-storey windows, often with a shouted warning, if you're lucky. In places like medieval London or Paris, open gutters known as kennels run down the middle of the street. They're filled with rainwater, refuse and human waste. Children play nearby. Pigs wallow in the muck, and everyone accepts this as part of city life. This isn't to say that people didn't care about cleanliness. They did. It just meant something different. For example, smell was a big concern. Bad smells were believed to cause disease. So rather than removing the filth itself, people masked it. Herbs like rosemary, sage and lavender were hung in doorways or carried in small pouches. Perfumed pomanders were worn on belts or necklaces, not for fashion, but to ward off illness. Inside homes, rushes or straw were strewn on the floor to absorb spills and waste. These were rarely changed, and over time became layered with dirt, grease, bits of food, fleas, and everything else that fell. The smell of a medieval house, even a noble one, was heavy, earthy, sour, close. And then there's laundry. Washing clothes was a major chore, done only a few times a year. Linen was boiled in huge cauldrons with lye, scrubbed with rocks and dried in the sun. The process was rough and often wore garments out faster than wearing them, so most people simply wore the same outfit for weeks at a time, swapping underlayers when possible. If a nobleman had 6 shirts, he was considered well stocked. A peasant might have one. Under all of this is the medieval mindset. Cleanliness is not about the body, it's about appearance, morality, and modesty. Many church leaders taught that caring too much about the body was a form of vanity. Bathing too often was seen as prideful, even sinful. Monks might avoid washing for years as a sign of piety. Saints were praised for never touching water. In one case, St. Agnes was said to have died a virgin and unwashed, a double blessing. And yet, people still dreamed of being clean. There's evidence that some villagers would sneak down to the river at night to bathe in secret. Some folk tales describe magical fountains that heal and purify. Cleanliness, like wealth, was something most people longed for but could never quite attain. So here's the picture. A world where filth is normal, but not unimportant. Where smells matter, but bacteria is unknown. Where being visibly clean is nearly impossible, and yet the struggle for dignity remains. And the next time you curse a cold shower or a broken sink, imagine hauling 60 litres of water by hand just to share it with your family, and still ending the day smelling like smoke, sweat and straw. The real question is, how did anyone survive without modern hygiene at all? By the time the Middle Ages began to wane in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the idea of personal cleanliness was still a murky affair, muddy in both the literal and metaphorical sense. The Roman love for bathing had long since faded, and in its place stood a deeply rooted fear. Water could make you sick. This was no minor superstition. It was widely believed by doctors, priests and commoners alike that the body was kept healthy by a balance of humours, and opening the skin's pores with hot water allowed bad air or miasma to sneak in. Instead of preventing disease, baths were thought to invite it. That belief was reinforced by some of the deadliest pandemics in history. The Black Death that ravaged Europe in the mid-14th century did more than kill. It changed how people understood their own bodies. After watching entire towns fall to plague, many began to associate disease not with invisible germs, but with sensuality, softness, and excess moisture. Bathhouses, which had already become associated with prostitution, were shut down across much of Europe, not just for moral reasons, but for fear of infection. And with bathhouses gone, communal cleaning disappeared too. This left most people with 2 options, dry washing or selective washing, often of just the hands and face. Priests and physicians alike encourage people to wash parts of the body, not the whole, especially before meals or religious events. Full immersion, though, that was discouraged unless absolutely necessary. This didn't mean people had stopped caring about cleanliness altogether. Quite the opposite. They simply redefined it. Cleanliness became about clothing, smell, and spiritual purity. Wealthier people wore white linen to signal purity and status. They scented their hair with oils or powdered wigs. They perfumed their gloves. They surrounded themselves with flowers, incense, and pouches of sweet-smelling herbs. A clean smell became more important than a clean body. And all the while, actual soap remained a complicated matter. True soap, made from a combination of fat and lye, was expensive and harsh. It often caused skin irritation, especially when made with high-potency ashes. Most common soap was used only for laundry, not for the body. It was stored in hard, crumbly blocks and used sparingly. Only the very wealthy had access to softer, perfumed soap meant for personal use, and even they used it rarely. So what did people do? They substituted. In Italy, people rubbed themselves with olive oil and scraped it off with metal tools, mimicking Roman traditions. In parts of northern Europe, people dusted themselves with chalk, sand or bran to absorb oil. And in Spain, Moorish-influenced soaps made with plant ash and herbs were prized for their gentler feel, though again, they were costly and not widely available. Still, slowly, the tide began to turn. As trade routes opened in the Renaissance and scientific thinking took root, people began to experiment with different kinds of soap, water filtration, and private bathing facilities. Rich households began adding dedicated bathing rooms, though these were nothing like modern bathrooms. They often had tubs on wheels, fireplaces nearby, and basins for hand washing. There was also a slow but steady rediscovery of Roman texts. Scholars reading ancient manuals on hygiene began to question the anti-bathing logic of the Middle Ages. In Italy and parts of France, physicians began recommending warm baths again, for relaxation, to treat minor illness, and eventually even as a preventive measure. But it was still controversial. In Elizabethan England, for example, Queen Elizabeth reportedly claimed she bathed once a month, whether I need it or not. For her, that was generous. Many of her subjects would have found a monthly bath luxurious, unnecessary, or even improper. The resistance to bathing wasn't only about health, it was also about modesty. To be naked, even in private, was considered morally risky. In monasteries and convents, special robes were sometimes worn while bathing to ensure no part of the body was ever exposed. In noble homes, servants stood by during a bath, not to help with cleaning, but to ensure the bather didn't commit impure acts. Washing the body was seen as a slippery slope to touching the body, and that was simply not done. So when did things finally change? Not until much later. It wasn't until the 18th and 19th centuries, hundreds of years after the medieval period, that soap became widely affordable, plumbing became common, and the medical world finally accepted germ theory. It took the invention of microscopes, a better understanding of disease transmission, and public health reforms to convince people that regular bathing actually prevented illness. Until then, clean continued to mean covered, scented, or morally upright. And even then, old beliefs lingered. In rural areas, people still viewed water with suspicion. Some believed that bathing a baby too often would make it sickly. Others claimed that the skin holds in strength, and scrubbing it too hard would weaken the body. For centuries, being clean meant keeping your body intact, your skin closed, your smells pleasant, and your soul pure. Soap and water were never just about hygiene. They were about belief, culture, class, and control. Looking back, it's easy to think we've escaped all this. But consider this. When you skip a shower for a day, do you feel dirty or guilty? Do you clean because of health or because of what others might think? The Middle Ages may be long gone, but the idea that cleanliness is moral, social and visible is very much alive. And so, if you were to travel back to medieval Europe, you'd need to let go of your modern habits. You'd wear the same clothes for weeks. You'd brush your teeth with a stick, if at all. You'd avoid water like poison, carry herbs to cover your stink, and thank the saints if you got to wash your feet once a season. And if you tried to bathe daily, you'd be seen as odd, vain, maybe even dangerous. You wouldn't survive a medieval kitchen, not just because of the food. You walk into the kitchen of a medieval manor expecting the savoury smell of stew or the soft glow of a hearth, but instead you're hit with thick, choking smoke, the kind that stings your eyes and clings to your clothes. There's no chimney, just a hole in the thatched roof, and most of the smoke never finds its way out. The walls are black with soot. The air is thick. The floor is made of packed dirt, sticky with grease, ash, and spilled broth. Chickens scratch nearby, and a cat slinks along the shadows, hoping for scraps. This is where meals are made. But more often than not, this is also where danger begins. For one thing, there's the fire. Every meal starts with it, and every day risks ending in flames. Firewood is scarce and often damp. It crackles angrily when tossed into the hearth. Cooks rarely control the heat. They simply move pots closer or farther away from the blaze. A pot left too long boils over. A moment of distraction means burnt bread or scalded hands. Pot holders don't exist. Towels or rough cloths often used for other chores. Burns are common. So are cuts, splinters and infections. If you're lucky, you're in a manor house, and the kitchen is in a separate building to reduce the risk of burning the entire estate down. But if you're a peasant, your kitchen is your home, a corner of the one-room hut you sleep in, eat in, and store your animals in. Now let's talk about the tools. Knives are always sharp, but not necessarily clean. They're used to gut fish, slice meat, cut vegetables, open sacks of flour, and fend off rats. No soap, no disinfectant. A rinse in cold water counts as washing. Meat cleavers are heavy and blunt. Wooden spoons are splintered from use. Bowls and plates are carved from wood or made from rough ceramic, easily cracked, never fully scrubbed. Next comes the food itself. Let's start with meat. Unless you're rich or it's a feast day, you won't be eating much. What little meat you have might be salted, smoked or dried, and you don't always know how old it is. It may already be turning, but spices or heavy cooking will cover that up. And spices? Those are expensive. The average household doesn't have pepper or cinnamon. Instead, they use onions, leeks or garlic to hide the flavour of rot. Fish is common, especially on religious fasting days when meat is forbidden. But fish spoils fast, especially inland. There's no ice. Preservation is spotty. Eating spoiled fish is a gamble that many lose. If you've ever heard of fish poisoning, you should know it was a silent killer in the Middle Ages. Bread is the staple. It's made from coarse flour, often mixed with whatever is on hand. Beans, oats, even tree bark in bad years. Sometimes it's sour, sometimes mouldy, but always necessary. And the ovens? They're massive stone or clay structures fired once a day. The baker tests the heat by throwing in a handful of flour and watching how quickly it scorches. If you're a village woman, you don't even have your own oven. You bake your dough in the communal oven, alongside everyone else's, and hope the baker doesn't mix them up. The poorest people can't afford even that. They make flatbread over embers, or boil grains into porridge. Milk, if you have it, spoils fast, so it's quickly turned into cheese. Hard cheese keeps well, soft cheese does not. Eggs are seasonal and precious. Chickens don't lay in winter, and even when they do, their nests are hidden. Finding an egg is like winning a prize. Vegetables are mostly root crops, onions, turnips, leeks, cabbage if you're lucky. No tomatoes, no potatoes, no corn. Those come centuries later from the Americas. In the medieval kitchen, a stew might simmer all day, growing thicker as leftovers are added, boiled again, and served the next day. This pot might sit over the fire for a week straight, topped up daily with broth, grain, or scraps. It's called perpetual stew. Sounds economical, but bacteria love it. Food storage is also a challenge. There are no refrigerators. Instead, pantries are cool rooms, cellars, or just shelves near the fire. Vermin are constant companions. Mice, rats, insects. Grain is stored in sacks or barrels and often comes with a handful of weevils or maggots. You might sift them out. Or you might not. Even salt, a preservative, was expensive. Not every household could afford enough to dry meat or pickle vegetables. And sugar, almost mythical, a rare luxury for the upper class, used more like medicine than food. Water presents a final threat. It might be fetched from a stream, a well, or a rain barrel, but in a village, the water source is often shared with animals. There's manure nearby. Dead things float sometimes. Boiling is the safest way to drink water, but boiling takes fuel, which is expensive. So people drink small ale, a weak fermented beer, or thin wine, especially in towns. Even children drink it. Ironically, beer is safer than water, but brewing is a full-day task, and with brewing comes yeast, barrels, and careful timing. If you get it wrong, you waste ingredients, or worse, you poison someone. And this is all just to make food that, by modern standards, would taste bland, burnt, or sour. But that's not what kills you. What kills you is accident, infection, or spoiled food. Cooks work fast and rough. A dropped ladle falls into the ash and is scooped back up. A hunk of meat slips to the ground and is tossed back in. A cut on the hand turns septic. A splinter in the foot becomes an abscess. Burn wounds go untreated. Foodborne illness is not diagnosed. It's mysterious stomach pain followed by days of vomiting and fever, and often death. And yet, this kitchen feeds the world. It keeps people alive. Barely. It gives them celebration, nourishment and tradition. It's passed down from mother to daughter, from peasant to servant. It's brutal, chaotic and hot, but also sacred. Even as you cough in the smoke and wipe sweat from your brow, there's something oddly comforting about the rhythm of it. Stir, pour, slice, roast. It's messy. It's dangerous. But it's life. Still, it makes you wonder, how did anyone survive long enough to finish a meal? Let's imagine now you're not in a thatched cottage with a smoky hearth, but instead in a lord's castle. This isn't safety. It's scale. Everything is bigger, hotter, heavier, and far more chaotic. A noble kitchen in the late Middle Ages wasn't just a room. It was an industrial zone, a collection of chambers staffed by dozens of workers, each with their own strict role. And while the nobles dined in finery at long trestle tables lined with tapestries, behind the scenes the work was blistering, smoke-choked, and often thankless. First you'd pass through the pantry, which had nothing to do with dry food. In a noble household, the pantry managed bread, cheese, and tableware. Across from it was the buttery, where ale and wine were kept and poured. Neither room handled cooking. That happened in the great kitchen. You'd hear it before you saw it. Clanging pots, shouting orders, the roar of fires. At the centre of the medieval kitchen stood the great hearth or open fire. Above it turned the centrepiece of elite dining, the spit roast. This might be a boar, several birds stitched together, or a whole deer carcass, rotated for hours, sometimes an entire day. Turning the spit was exhausting, and in some households this job was assigned to the turn-spit dog, a special breed trained to run in a wheel that powered the rotating meat. Yes, that's right. In the Middle Ages, a dog did the work of a rotisserie motor. In larger kitchens, this was replaced by boys, typically orphans or low-ranking servants, who sat near the flame, hand-cranking meat in blistering heat and greasy air. Their eyes would sting from smoke, their arms ached. They couldn't leave the spit, not even to eat. Other cooks handled bread, stews, pies, sauces, pastries. Each task required a different station and set of tools. Large cauldrons bubbled over brick ovens. Enormous knives sliced cuts of meat as thick as your forearm. Mortars and pestles the size of helmets crushed spices and herbs. And unlike modern kitchens, there was no central counter or sanitation zone. Raw meat sat beside cooked pies. Live birds waited for slaughter beside tubs of flour. The blood gutter in the corner stank by mid-morning. Even elite kitchens swarmed with danger. Hot tallow splashing from candles, barrels of ale bursting, grease fires racing across wooden floors. Many castles, like monasteries, had kitchens built at a distance from the main hall to reduce the risk of burning the entire structure down. Now imagine it's feast day. The kitchen is a battlefield. Medieval feasts weren't just meals. They were performances. A single banquet might feature 50 to 100 different dishes, from swan glazed in gold leaf to fish pies shaped like castles. Some dishes weren't even meant to be eaten. They were displays of wealth and artistry. One infamous example, the 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie. This wasn't just a nursery rhyme. Real accounts describe pies with live birds sealed inside only to burst out when the crust was cut, flapping wildly, to the guests' delight. These weren't just chefs. They were engineers, artists, and showmen, creating illusions with sugar, flour, and meat. But every illusion was dangerous. Candied towers collapsed. Hot sugar burned like napalm. Live animals sometimes panicked or bit someone. And all the while, the kitchens had to feed the dozens of servants who weren't even part of the feast. Cooks, guards, pages, stable boys. Then there's food safety. The upper class had more food, but that didn't mean safer food. In fact, the obsession with luxury created its own hazards. Spoiled meat was masked with spice. Eels and lampreys, prized for their richness, often carried parasites. Raw eggs were used in many sauces, and because refrigeration didn't exist, food served at night had often sat out since morning, or longer. Many nobles suffered stomach illnesses, parasites, and gout from the heavy, preserved, or improperly handled food. Autopsies of aristocrats have shown bloated organs, chronic inflammation, and internal worms. Lavish dining came at a biological cost, but prestige mattered more than digestion. At great halls, food was ranked and served in order of importance. The lord received the best cuts, seasoned dishes, and warm servings. Further down the table, food grew colder, simpler, and often more dangerous. Servants got the scraps, gristle, burnt bread, old stew. And manners, there were no forks. They weren't widely used until much later. People ate with knives and fingers. Bread trenchers soaked up juice and were either eaten, thrown to dogs, or handed to the poor. Double dipping was expected, so were shared cups and spoons, but rules existed. Diners were expected to wipe their fingers on the tablecloth, not their clothes. Blowing one's nose in the napkin was rude. Spitting on the floor was fine as long as it was done discreetly. In the end, the feast was not just a meal, it was a symbol of order, wealth, and power. But it rested on a mountain of chaos, labour, and danger. You may think cooking today is hard, but imagine working in a room full of open flames, butchered animals, suspicious meat, no soap, and a boss who expects flaming peacocks and dancing pies. You didn't just need to cook, you needed to survive. Close your eyes and imagine this. It's before sunrise, and the kitchen fire hasn't gone out all night. The coals are red, the air is warm from yesterday's stew pot, and the walls weep with moisture. A cook wakes up, not in a soft bed, but on a straw mat near the kitchen's cold corner, surrounded by the day's still dirty pots. This is the medieval cook. Not a chef in a tall white hat, not a culinary celebrity. Just someone responsible for making sure everyone eats without dying. And if they fail, someone else might die. But it won't be them who pays the price. It'll be the lowest of the low, the kitchen hands. The cook in a large estate might be a man, skilled and respected. But in many homes, especially village houses, monasteries and manors, the primary cook was a woman. She juggled 1,000 tasks, lighting fires, managing stores, baking bread, boiling broth, tending to children, feeding animals, and making sure no one poisoned themselves on rotten fish. This work was endless and invisible. No one praised it, no one thanked her, and if the food was bad, it was her fault. Now, enter the scullion, the lowest rank in the medieval kitchen. Usually a young boy or a poor woman, the scullion didn't cook. They scrubbed, with no soap, no rubber gloves, no sinks. Pots were made of iron, copper or clay, all heavy, all soot-stained, all coated with animal fat, burnt grain or dried porridge. To clean them, the scullion would crawl to the water source, maybe a cold stream in winter, and scrub the pans with handfuls of sand, straw or ashes. Their hands bled, their backs ached. No one noticed. The scullery floor was always wet. Wood rotted beneath their feet. Rats scurried by. Food scraps turned to mush. But the work never stopped. There were knives to be sharpened, barrels to scrub, bones to carry, and grease to be scraped off wooden boards. Even more dangerous were the seasonal staff. During a feast, the noble household might hire a dozen temporary helpers, some from the village, some from other households, some from the street. They had no job security. If they made a mistake, burned the roast, dropped the jug of wine, or fainted from heat exhaustion, they were dismissed or punished. In the monastery kitchens, things weren't much better. Though monks had strict rules and ate modest meals, someone still had to cook for them. That task fell to the lay brothers or hired help. Silence was often required, even while cooking. Imagine boiling cabbage in silence, praying inwardly, and wiping steam from your eyes while stirring porridge for 50. Hygiene was a gamble. Latrines weren't always far from the kitchen, and the rules about washing hands before food prep, inconsistent at best. In monasteries, maybe you'd wash before cooking as part of ritual purity, but in towns and homes you might go from slaughtering a pig to kneading dough without more than a wipe on your apron. Now imagine illness creeping into the kitchen. One day the cook starts coughing. Maybe it's just the smoke, maybe it's the plague. You keep working anyway. There's no such thing as sick leave. If a cook dies, someone else fills the role and the kitchen goes on. If the household's nobleman dies from tainted meat or spoiled wine, heads might roll. Someone is blamed, often the cook. Historical records include grim tales of cooks beheaded, whipped, or banished for serving corrupted food. But many times, it wasn't even the cook's fault. Perhaps a fishmonger sold bad fish, or the weather turned hot and spoiled the stew overnight, or someone, intentionally or not, slipped something bitter into the broth. With no modern science, there were few explanations beyond blame and punishment. And still, the kitchen was the beating heart of any household. It held community and ritual. People shared bread. Prayers were said over boiling kettles. Cooks taught daughters how to salt meat, how to make pottage, how to keep the fire low so it wouldn't go out at night. Secrets passed from generation to generation through recipes scribbled in margins, if at all. Even in royal palaces, where hundreds were fed every day, things weren't glamorous. In 14th century England, King Edward III's kitchen staff included sergeants, porters, larders, saucers, scullions, and sergeants of the spit, all part of a vast machine that fed the court. The records show lists of spices, fowl, wine, and ale, but behind those lists, human hands, calloused, burnt, overworked, and in towns, the public cookshops, early restaurants served stews to travellers and labourers. You didn't ask what was in them. If you had a penny, you got a bowl. If you didn't, you starved. One surviving record from a medieval French cookshop reveals that the house special was often a mixture of last night's beef, stale barley, cabbage ends, and a few pigeon bones. Was it nutritious? Possibly. Was it fresh? Doubtful. Was it safe? Questionable. But it was food, and for the cookshop's owner, often a woman, it meant survival. In the end, surviving a medieval kitchen wasn't about recipes or ingredients, it was about endurance. You had to withstand the burns, the blisters, the smoke, the long hours, the cold water, the spoiled meat, and the silent hunger in your gut while you worked. And yet people did survive. For centuries. Meals were made, bread was broken, children grew up around the fire, learning when to stir and when to run. Recipes changed, techniques improved. But the kitchen, with all its danger and smoke and grit, remained. So next time you microwave leftovers or wash a pan with warm soapy water, remember the hands that came before you, cut, blistered, and blackened from centuries of survival. Because really, how many of us could survive the medieval kitchen for even one day, the time people believed you could cure everything with leeches? Let's set the scene. You wake up in a medieval village. Your head is pounding. Your stomach feels wrong. Maybe you ate too much oat porridge. Or maybe your water bucket, drawn from the well down the road, was laced with something a little more exciting, like animal waste or a nice colony of intestinal parasites. What do? There's no pharmacy, no emergency room, no acetaminophen. If you're lucky, someone in your village knows how to make a weak tea of fennel and dried wormwood. If you're less lucky, your neighbour recommends a local physician, which in this case means a man with no formal training, a pointy beard, and a jar full of leeches. Welcome to the world of medieval medicine. To understand how we got here, we need to talk about the four humours, not jokes, but bodily fluids. This was the cornerstone of pre-modern medicine in Europe for over 1,000 years, inherited from the writings of Greek thinkers like Hippocrates and Galen. According to this theory, your body was a soup of four main fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Health meant balance. Illness meant imbalance. Got a fever? Too much blood. Feeling sluggish? Too much phlegm. Depressed and melancholic? Black bile. The solution to every problem wasn't take a pill, it was get the excess out, preferably by cutting, burning, vomiting, or draining. That's where the leech came in. Leeches were used across Europe, particularly from the early Middle Ages through the 19th century. They weren't just a folk remedy. They were backed by respected science. Hospitals, monasteries, and city doctors all used them. These creatures, about the length of your pinky, were kept in jars, cool, wet, and hungry. When applied to the skin, a leech would bite, release a small amount of natural anaesthetic, and begin feeding. They could suck 5 to 10 times their body weight in blood and fall off when full. The bleeding would continue for hours. Why? Because bleeding was believed to cool the body, calm inflammation, reduce fever, treat bad thoughts, and restore balance. And it was thorough. A patient might have a dozen leeches placed around the neck, behind the ears, on the legs, and even inside the nostrils or the throat. In women, bleeding from the thighs or the back was common. For children, smaller leeches were used, or so they claimed. Sometimes the leeches wouldn't feed properly. Doctors might slice the skin first. If the bleeding didn't stop, they'd cauterize it with hot irons. If infection set in, you were told to pray. But leeches weren't the only cure. Let's say you had a persistent cough. Your healer might suggest a blistering agent, a chemical salve made from mustard seed, hot peppers, or powdered Spanish fly. This would be rubbed into the chest to cause a raised, painful blister. The theory was that drawing heat or poison to the surface would clear up internal disease. What it actually caused was pain, infection, and scars. Still coughing? Then it's time for purging. You'd be given something to make you vomit, like white hellebore root or antimony. both toxic, both likely to cause cramping, dehydration, and vomiting violent enough to rupture blood vessels in your throat. But hey, at least you got the bad humours out. For the bowels, a quick laxative was in order. The go-to mix might include senna leaves, rhubarb root, and goose fat. Sometimes soap was boiled into the solution. Enemas were common too, administered with a long metal syringe and no privacy. Even relatively healthy people underwent regular cleansings as a preventative measure. Wealthy nobles were bled seasonally, just in case. Monks underwent purging fasts that involved days of drinking nothing but herb-laced vinegar or raw onion juice. There was no such thing as too much bloodletting. One 13th century medical manual advised bloodletting at the onset of every season change, and more often if you had a pale complexion or were melancholic. Children as young as 4 years old were bled to prevent excess growth of moisture in the brain. And yet, even with all this, people survived. Sometimes. Why? Because many mild illnesses simply go away on their own. The body heals even when the treatment doesn't help, and sometimes even when it hurts. In the last section, you heard about leeches, urine charts, blistering salves, and the ancient belief in the four humours. But medieval medicine wasn't just practised in the quiet chambers of cloisters or the musty rooms of a learned doctor's home. Some of the most dramatic and dangerous treatments were carried out in full view of the public, often with a straight razor, a wooden chair, and a bowl to catch your blood. Let's talk about the barber surgeon. Yes, you heard that right. The person who might cut your hair, trim your beard, and shine your shoes could also cut you open, extract teeth, lance boils, and perform minor surgery. The red and white pole we still see outside barbershops today? It's a leftover from this strange hybrid profession. Red for blood, white for bandages. The barber surgeon was not a doctor in the academic sense. He wasn't trained at a university. He didn't study Greek or Latin texts, but he had tools, experience, and steady hands. And for most people, that was more than enough. After all, university-trained physicians rarely got their hands dirty. The messy jobs, amputations, extractions, and bleeds, were outsourced to the barbers. Let's picture one. You sit down on a low wooden stool. There's a strap across your chest to keep you from jerking. You're told to bite down on a leather belt or a piece of wood. The barber rolls up his sleeves, wipes his blade on a cloth that's never truly clean, and presses the tip to your skin. If you're there for a bleeding, he ties a tight cord around your arm to make the vein rise. Then he opens it, just a nick, and lets your blood drain into a metal bowl. The goal isn't just a few drops. The barber might remove a pint or more depending on your age, your size, and how unbalanced you seem. If you faint, that's normal. If you vomit, they say it means the humours are working. Once done, he packs the wound with cobwebs, moss, or crushed herbs. If you're lucky, it clots. If you're not, it becomes infected. But bleeding was only one service. Barber surgeons also removed teeth. No anaesthesia, no sanitation. You sat still while a tool like a hooked forceps or a key-like instrument was jammed into your mouth and twisted hard. If the tooth broke, they dug for the root with a spike. They lanced boils and abscesses too. With a sharp blade, they'd slice the swelling open and let the pus run out. Then came a poultice, maybe a paste of vinegar, onions, and goose fat. Infection was common. Sometimes maggots helped. They'd eat the dead flesh and leave the living tissue alone. And then there were trepanations. In rare cases, a barber surgeon might drill into the skull of someone suffering from seizures, headaches, or mental illness. This wasn't done casually. It was a last resort. Using a hand-cranked tool, they'd carve a hole in the cranium to release pressure or let out evil vapours. Shockingly, some people survived. Why was this allowed? Because the church and the crown both endorsed it. Barber surgeons were organised into guilds and sometimes even paid by towns or monasteries to provide services to the poor. In battle, they worked on the front lines, stitching wounds and cutting off infected limbs. Crude, yes, but sometimes effective, and in many cases the only option. Of course, most ordinary people avoided both the physician and the barber, unless truly desperate. Instead, they turned to home remedies and folk cures, passed down through generations. Got a cold? Boil elderflower and mint, wrap your head, and sweat it out. Aching joints? Rub on warm goose fat and bind the limb with linen. Troubled sleep? Hang a sprig of lavender near your bed. Bad stomach? Chew fennel seeds and sip bone broth. Some cures were harmless, some were helpful, and some were dangerously misguided. A popular treatment for plague swellings involved placing a roasted onion mixed with butter and treacle over the sore. Others used dried toads, crushed emeralds, or powdered unicorn horn, usually fake, usually expensive. Still others tried flagellation, whipping themselves in the streets to please God and banish illness. In the countryside, midwives played a vital role. They delivered babies, treated infections, and administered herbal remedies. Some had extensive knowledge born from experience and practice, but many faced suspicion from the church. After all, if you healed without a man's permission, was it medicine or magic? Meanwhile, monks and nuns quietly advanced medicine inside the walls of monasteries. They maintained herb gardens, copied medical texts, and operated infirmaries for the sick. Some developed early forms of pain relief using willow bark, a natural source of salicylic acid, the base of aspirin, or crafted antiseptic washes from vinegar and herbs. They also invented diagnostic tools, charts for urine colour, tables of pulse rhythms, guides to seasonal bleeding. They kept patient logs, tested recipes, and even performed autopsies in secret when the church allowed it. But despite all this effort, the central medical logic remained the same: balance the humours. And if that meant more bloodletting, more vomiting, or another boil to be lanced, so be it. This raises a strange contradiction. The most painful treatments were often the most trusted. The more you bled, the more it felt like the illness was leaving your body. Pain meant progress. Suffering meant success. Modern medicine tells a different story, but back then, when your world was bounded by mystery, divine will, and ancient tradition, what else could you trust? So here's a quiet thought to leave you with tonight. If your survival depended on a man with a knife and no soap, would you take the seat in the barber's chair or take your chances with the fever? By now, you've sat in the bleeding chair. You've seen the barbers with blades, the monks with mortars and pestles, and the healers accused of witchcraft. You've smelled vinegar-soaked masks and chewed bitter roots. You've been blistered, purged, and bled. And somehow, you're still alive. Which begs the question, how did anyone survive medieval medicine at all? The surprising answer is, the human body is remarkably good at healing itself, and people back then, despite the strange logic of their treatments, were often just as aware of this as we are. Even as they followed harmful protocols, people still nursed the sick with food and warmth. They let wounds rest, used natural disinfectants without knowing the science behind them, and relied heavily on touch, patience, and time. In short, they got better in spite of the medicine, not because of it. Take childbirth. It was incredibly dangerous. 1 in 3 women might die in labour over her lifetime. But midwives, women trained through generations, developed effective, calming, and practical methods. They used birthing stools to position the mother, herbal drinks to dull the pain, and warm cloths to ease tearing. It wasn't sterilised, but it wasn't reckless either. Midwives watched, waited, and helped, far more gently than any doctor with a scalpel. When plagues swept through towns, some people isolated, washed hands, burned bedding, and fled to cleaner places, all without understanding bacteria. Monasteries with cleaner habits and routines often fared better than crowded cities. Folk medicine, too, was full of surprising wisdom. Garlic poultices helped fight infection. Willow bark soothed pain. Honey, spread over wounds, had antibacterial properties. Not all treatments worked, but many, though dismissed as superstition, had real value. But more than anything, people survived because they knew when to wait. Not every fever was treated with fire. Not every cough led to bloodletting. People watched, rested, and let nature do its work. Some even refused the bleeding chair, seeing it as too risky. And just as today, young bodies, strong immune systems, and luck played a huge role, still, the threat of death was always near. A minor wound could kill. A sore tooth could spread infection to the brain. A stomachache could mean parasites, ulcers, or appendicitis, with no names and no cure. And yet, people didn't live in fear every moment. Life carried on. They found comfort in rituals. They said prayers, wore charms, and trusted in divine protection. They leaned on community and routine, neighbours checking in, wives brewing teas, children bringing warm stones to the sickbed. Even when the doctors failed, the people didn't. In that way, medieval medicine wasn't just about treatments. It was about belief. Belief that illness could be explained, that suffering could be cured, that nature had rhythms and rules. Whether through humours or herbs, saints or salves, people wanted to understand their pain, and that search gave meaning, even when it gave no answers. By the 14th and 15th centuries, some cracks began to appear in old thinking. New translations of ancient texts arrived from the Islamic world, where scholars like Avicenna and Al-Razi had preserved and refined Greek knowledge. Universities expanded. Anatomy was studied, sometimes illegally, using cadavers. Observations improved. Herbal compendiums grew more accurate. Barbers became surgeons. Surgeons became doctors, but progress was slow. Bloodletting, for example, remained a standard treatment into the 1800s. Even George Washington in 1799 was bled heavily when he caught a throat infection. He died the same day, likely from shock and loss of blood. So what finally changed? One turning point came in the 16th century, when Andreas Vesalius, a Flemish anatomist, published a revolutionary anatomy book based on real dissection. It corrected centuries of errors from Galen, who had based human anatomy on monkeys and pigs. Later, William Harvey discovered how blood actually circulates. Antony van Leeuwenhoek looked through a microscope and saw bacteria. Edward Jenner developed the first vaccine. Slowly, superstition gave way to observation. Bleeding fell out of favour. Germ theory took hold. Anesthesia arrived. But leeches? They never quite left. Even today, in rare cases, modern doctors use leeches in plastic surgery to stimulate blood flow to damaged tissue. The science is very different now, of course, but the creature remains, clinging to its strange legacy. So the next time you see a red and white barber pole, or open your medicine cabinet, or feel a sore throat and reach for a pill, remember this. You could have been strapped into a chair, your vein cut open, a leech placed behind your ear, a priest whispering last rites in the corner, all in the name of healing, and somehow you might have survived. But would you really want to?